Welcome to Relic of Stories. Before love and romance as we imagine them today, marriage was survival, power, and destiny. For women across the ages, the choice of a husband was rarely guided by chance or fleeting affection. It was a matter of security, lineage, and social standing, and so careful methods emerged, subtle tests, silent observations, and trials both spoken and unspoken, to reveal whether a man was truly husband material. Tonight, we step into the hidden past, where ancient women judged not only strength, but wisdom, generosity, and endurance, in ways that may surprise you. Strength of the hunter. In the earliest human societies where survival was fragile and uncertain, the question of who a woman would choose as her husband was not one of charm or poetry, but of strength, endurance, and the promise of security. Before cities rose, before the walls of kingdoms, before ink and parchment could record the rules of courtship, men were judged by something far older, by their ability to hunt, to fight, and to endure. For the women of these early tribes, the man who would become their partner was not simply a companion, but a lifeline. His skill with a bow, his courage in the chase, and his strength in facing the wilderness would often mean the difference between hunger and plenty, between protection and exposure. In this world, courtship began not with words, but with actions, measured in blood, sweat, and survival. The rituals of selection were often woven into the fabric of daily life. A man's worth could be revealed in the hunt. A successful kill was not only a test of precision, but of patience, courage, and foresight. To bring down a deer or a wild boar was to show control over chaos, to prove that he could face the danger of the world and bend it toward the survival of his people. For a woman watching from the edge of the campfire, the sight of a man returning with meat on his shoulders was far more persuasive than any promise whispered under the stars. Anthropologists studying the remnants of these ancient practices have found echoes in the traditions of many hunter-gatherer societies. In the plains of Africa, a man who could chase and bring down an antelope was seen not just as a provider, but as a symbol of endurance. The hunt was a performance, a demonstration of stamina and strength, a living declaration that he was worthy of continuing the bloodline. Women, knowingly or not, looked for these qualities, for they understood that strength meant survival. But it was not always about brute force. Some tribes tested a man's subtlety and cunning. Among early Native American groups, for instance, hunting skills included silence, patience, and the ability to read the movements of animals as if reading a book. To track a deer for hours without being seen, to understand the rhythm of the forest, was as vital as having strong arms. Women often watched these demonstrations of discipline with deep interest, for they knew that a man who could control himself in the wilderness could also provide calm stability in the harshness of life. There were also ceremonial contests that blurred the line between hunting and ritual. In some regions, young men were given trials, tasks to test their worthiness as husbands. They might be sent into the forest with a single spear, challenged to return with food before the sun fell. Failure was not just personal shame. It could mark them as unworthy of partnership. Success, however, was a signal to the entire tribe, a living declaration that this man had crossed the threshold from youth into the responsibilities of manhood. In ancient Mongolia, horsemen were often tested by long hunts across the steppes, where the speed of the chase and the accuracy of the bow determined who was strong enough to lead, to protect, and to wed. There was no greater sign of husband material than a warrior who could strike a running target from horseback, providing both food and proof of skill. Women who witnessed such feats knew instinctively that such a man would bring stability and safety to their lives. But these tests were not always grand spectacles. Sometimes the simplest acts revealed the deepest truths. In Arctic tribes, women often judged men by their ability to fish through the ice, to withstand the cold, and to share their catch. Generosity was as important as strength, for a man who hoarded food was no partner but a liability. A man who willingly shared his catch with the tribe, who placed survival above pride, revealed a heart that women trusted. The underlying truth remained the same. Strength and endurance were the measures of manhood, and women were the silent judges. They watched carefully, noting who stumbled under the weight of the hunt, who returned empty-handed, who panicked in danger. They also noticed who bore scars of courage, who returned despite injury, who placed the needs of others above themselves. These observations became the quiet foundation of choice, the ancient calculus of survival that decided who was fit to be called husband. Imagine the firelight of those early camps, the women sitting close together, children at their sides, waiting for the hunters to return. Each sound in the darkness brought hope or fear. The rustle of leaves might mean prey or predator. And then, at last, the hunters would return, carrying the fruits of their labor. A man's face, streaked with sweat and dust, his arms heavy with game, spoke volumes without words. The women saw not only his victory, but his promise, that tomorrow and the day after, there would be food, there would be safety. And yet, the test did not end at the hunt. Some tribes challenged men further, forcing them to prove resilience in competitions of strength. Wrestling matches, foot races, or endurance trials decided who had the stamina to withstand the hardships of life. The women watched, quietly calculating who might falter under the pressures of a long, harsh winter, and who would endure. It is easy today to imagine marriage as a matter of affection, of shared feelings and romance. But in the ancient world, affection came after survival, not before. The trials of the hunter were the first step in a long journey toward companionship. A woman who chose a strong man did not merely secure a partner. She secured the future of her children, the survival of her people, and the continuity of her lineage. The strength of the hunter was not just physical power, but the embodiment of dependability. It was the language of action, the speech of survival, the earliest form of courtship ritual. Through every spear throw, every track followed, every animal brought back to the fire, a man spoke to the women of his tribe without uttering a word. I can protect you, I can feed you, I can endure the world by your side. The trial of wealth and land. In the medieval world, marriage was rarely a matter of the heart. It was a matter of legacy, of alliances, and of survival. And for a woman, the choice of a husband was not only a personal step, but a decision that could shape the fate of entire families. Unlike the tribal hunter who proved himself with his bow, here the measure of a man was different. It lay in the weight of his coins, the reach of his lands, and the promises of power that followed his name. Imagine a young noblewoman in a candlelit hall, her father seated beside her, courtiers gathered, and suitors arriving one after another. They did not come with weapons or hunting trophies. They came with gifts of gold, velvet, and parchment. Some brought caskets of silver, some brought deeds to fertile fields, and others brought promises of soldiers, fortresses, or trade rights. Each offering was carefully examined, not only by her family, but by the watchful eyes of those who measured worth in numbers rather than words. The man who wished for her hand had to prove he could keep her secure, that her children would grow under roofs that never leaked, that her table would never lack bread or wine, and that her life would not descend into the hardships of poverty. Land was not just dirt, it was power. It was the means to grow food, to house workers, to command respect, and in many cases, it was the very reason wars were fought. A man with land could promise safety, while a man without it was seen as fragile, rootless, and unworthy of marriage. But wealth alone was not enough. A suitor's riches had to be stable, recognized, and respected. There were merchants with overflowing chests of coin, yet they lacked noble birth, and though their gold shone brightly, it could not erase the bloodlines that noble families guarded with obsession. And so, many women of status faced the choice between wealth without heritage or lineage without fortune. In those choices, alliances were forged, and sometimes lifelong regrets were sealed. For ordinary women beyond the noble courts, the trial of wealth was more practical, more grounded, yet equally decisive. A farmer's daughter looked at a man's oxen, his tools, his harvest, and asked herself, could he feed a family? Could he survive winter? Could he keep a roof standing when storms came? The smallest signs mattered: a strong field of wheat, a well-kept plow, or even the way he handled a market bargain. Each detail was a silent trial, and women judged with sharper eyes than many men realized. The dowry also played a role, for in many lands, a woman herself came with wealth attached, carried not in her own name, but through her father's hand. Her marriage meant an exchange, a merging of fortunes, and her suitor's ability to match or elevate her dowry was essential. This exchange could lift a family into prominence, or bind them to ruin if the match was poorly chosen. Thus, the trial of wealth was not only the test of the suitor, it was also the test of the woman's own family, for their decision would echo for generations. And so, the rituals unfolded. In France, contracts were written long before vows were spoken. In England, knights swore not only loyalty, but declared their estates as tokens of love. In the East, treasures of silk and spice spoke louder than any poem. And everywhere, behind the public displays of wealth, quiet negotiations determined which suitor truly had the strength of fortune to endure. Yet, even in these trials, there were whispers of rebellion. Some women saw through the glitter of coins and the promise of land, and they longed for something more. They chose men of lesser means, men who carried no great estates, but who brought warmth, laughter, and courage. These unions were rare, often resisted, sometimes forbidden, but they carried within them a truth that gold could not silence. That security of the heart could mean more than the riches of the earth. Still, history remembers most the alliances of power, the marriages where land was stitched together like fabric, where gold was passed like blood, and where women were measured as much by the dowry they carried as by the sons they would bear. In these halls of stone and wealth, the trial of a husband was not a duel of strength, but a negotiation of fortune. And in those quiet exchanges, kingdoms rose and fell. So, when we look back at the medieval world, we see marriage not as romance, but as economy, as strategy, as chess. The suitor with wealth and land did not simply win a bride, he won influence, allies, and stability. And the woman who chose him, whether willingly or under the pressure of her kin, played her part in a larger story, a story where love was rare, but power was constant, and where the trial of wealth decided more than a man's worth. It decided destiny itself, tests of character and honor. In the ancient world, strength and wealth might win admiration, but true marriage often depended on something harder to measure: a man's character. In places like Greece, Rome, and even far beyond, women and their families quietly tested suitors, not with gold or muscles, but with virtue, wisdom, and honor. A man might impress with a heroic tale, but one cruel word, one selfish act, could undo everything. Imagine a bustling Athenian courtyard. A suitor stands before a young woman's father, boasting of his victories in the gymnasium. His arms are strong, his voice carries pride, but then comes the quiet test. How does he speak to the servants? Does he dismiss them rudely or thank them as equals? The girl and her family notice. The neighbors notice. A careless insult could mark him as dishonorable. In Athens, reputation was everything, and a man's tongue revealed more than his sword. In Rome, honor carried even greater weight. A young Roman might parade his lineage, his victories in battle, his father's estate. But Roman women were not easily fooled. They looked for fidelity, for loyalty to family and friends. A man who lied, cheated, or sought only his own glory risked shame, and shame was a heavy price in Rome. Women spoke among themselves, quietly sharing stories of suitors who drank too much, gambled too freely, or mocked the gods. By the time a man arrived at the family door, his reputation had often walked in long before him. Even small gestures mattered. A suitor who returned a borrowed cloak, who kept his word on a promise, or who defended a friend's honor in the marketplace earned quiet respect. In contrast, a man who turned his back on a beggar, or who quarreled needlessly, could lose everything. Honor was not a loud banner. It was a collection of small choices, measured in the silence of watching eyes. Philosophers wrote about this too. Socrates insisted that virtue was the true wealth of a man. To be wise, temperate, and just mattered more than riches or strength. Aristotle described honor as the crown of virtue, something earned only by consistent action. Women may not have quoted philosophy in their courtyards, but the wisdom was alive in their judgment. They wanted men who would treat them with fairness, who would raise children with integrity, who would not bring disgrace upon their household. Stories spread of suitors tested in subtle ways. A woman might drop a piece of bread in front of a man, watching whether he shared it with a child or ate it himself. A family might ask a man to tend the animals, not to see his skill, but to witness his patience. Some fathers even tested suitors by provoking them with sharp words, waiting to see if they answered with temper or restraint. These were not games of chance. They were windows into the soul, and honor was fragile. A single betrayal could shatter it. A man caught lying about his debts or spreading false stories of rivals could lose his bride overnight. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to mend. Women understood this well. In cultures where their own lives depended on a husband's standing, the risk of dishonor was too great. Yet, when a man proved himself, when his words matched his actions, he was celebrated. Songs were sung of husbands who stood loyal even in hardship, who refused to abandon friends in battle, who honored their wives in public as equals. These were the men whose names lived on, not because of gold or muscle, but because of character. The test of honor stretched beyond Greece and Rome. In distant cultures, from Persia to India, men faced similar trials. A suitor might be asked to protect a stranger, to mediate a dispute, or to show kindness to a rival. Everywhere, the truth was the same. Honor was a universal language, and women listened carefully to how a man spoke it. In the end, character was not just about winning a bride. It was about proving oneself worthy of trust. Ancient societies knew what we often forget today. Strength fades, wealth shifts, but honor, once lost, rarely returns. And so, for countless men across the ancient world, the greatest trial in love was not found in the hunt or the treasury, but in the quiet question of character, the ritual of dowries and gifts. In the old world, when two families considered binding their lives together through marriage, the question was never asked with words alone. A man could speak of love. He could swear his devotion. He could promise a lifetime of loyalty. Yet none of those vows carried weight until they were made visible through gifts, through offerings, through the act of sacrifice. Across kingdoms and empires, from the dusty roads of India to the shaded courtyards of Africa, from the bustling markets of the Mediterranean to the wooden halls of Europe, the dowry and the gift stood as proof of sincerity. It was not merely a matter of wealth, it was a language of respect, a public demonstration that the man understood the gravity of what he sought. To ask for a woman's hand was to step into a trial, and in this trial, the offering was the testimony. The dowry in many cultures flowed not from the groom, but from the bride's family. It was wealth transferred outward, intended to secure her future in another household, a safeguard of her comfort, a sign of her worth. Yet, alongside the dowry, the gifts of the groom mattered just as much, sometimes even more. He brought cattle, horses, or camels in the deserts of Arabia. He brought silks and spices in the trading hubs of the East. He brought swords, shields, or fine cloaks in the warrior societies of Europe. Each gift was chosen not only for its value, but for its meaning. A sword might declare protection, a cloak might declare warmth, a chest of gold might declare abundance. And the woman, along with her kin, would look closely. Was the offering generous or meager? Was it given freely or reluctantly? Did it speak of sacrifice or of mere convenience? For in every pearl, every coin, every jewel, they read the truth of the man's intentions. In Japan, centuries ago, the exchange of gifts between families was ritualized with precision. The betrothal gifts, known as yuino, included items wrapped in symbolic meanings: dried seafood for longevity, a fan for prosperity, thread for binding two souls together. These were not random offerings, but a carefully curated language of objects. A single forgotten gift could be read as an omen, a warning that the union would not last. In the kingdoms of Africa, cattle were more than wealth. They were life itself, a measure of a man's strength and his ability to provide. To bring cattle as bride wealth was not a simple purchase. It was a declaration that he could sustain not only his bride, but generations to come. A man who offered too few risked shame, whispers of weakness that would cling to him long after the courtship ended. In India, dowries often carried jewels, textiles, and land deeds. They were not simply ornaments, they were insurance. A necklace of gold could be melted into coin in times of hardship. A silk garment could be traded when hunger struck. The man who accepted such treasures bore responsibility to guard them, to use them wisely, to ensure the woman did not fall into ruin under his care. But the gifts were not always about wealth. In some villages, a man might bring nothing but his labor. He would work in the fields of the bride's family for years, proving his worth not with coin, but with sweat. His muscles, his endurance, his persistence became the dowry. In this sacrifice of time and toil, families saw the clearest truth. Here was a man who valued their daughter enough to bend his back to the earth, season after season, with no reward but her hand. Even in Europe, where noble families demanded coin and castles, there remained the humble tokens of affection: a carved wooden comb, shaped by the groom's own hands, a lock of hair wrapped in silk, tied with trembling fingers. These small gestures mattered, for they whispered sincerity that no pile of gold could buy. The dowry and the gifts, however, also carried danger. They bound love to transaction, devotion to commerce. There were whispers of daughters traded away for the highest bid, of alliances forged not from affection, but from greed. Many women bore the weight of treasures they did not ask for, entering households where the glitter of gold could not hide the emptiness of the bond. Yet even in such shadows, the ritual of gifts held its power, for a man unwilling to give, a man who withheld, revealed himself as one who valued little, and a man who gave freely, even if poor, revealed a heart of seriousness. It was not the richness of the gift, but the depth of the sacrifice that women sought. A pearl plucked from hardship shone brighter than a chest of jewels given without care. One can imagine the ancient scenes. The suitor arriving at the family home, his hands burdened with offerings. The household gathered, watching silently. The father measuring his steps, the mother weighing his smile, the bride-to-be gazing not at the gifts, but at the man himself, searching his eyes for truth. And as the gifts were laid down, the judgment began. The bracelets of silver, the jars of honey, the bolts of silk, the livestock tethered at the gate, each was studied not as an object, but as a mirror. Did they reflect a man of devotion or a man of vanity? Did they reveal effort or only ease? For in that moment, more than words, more than poetry, the gifts spoke. Even the poorest man knew this. He might come with nothing but a single lamb or a basket of grain. Yet if it was the best he could give, if it carried the mark of sacrifice, it was worth more than the careless wealth of another. Many tales were told of women who turned away from rich men and chose instead the humble giver, for they saw in his offering the promise of a truer love. Thus the ritual of dowries and gifts stood as a trial across centuries. It was not merely an exchange of property. It was a stage upon which love, duty, and respect were tested. The gifts were never just things. They were symbols, carved out of sweat, out of pride, out of hope. And every bride who received them, whether with joy or with sorrow, knew that she was not simply accepting wealth. She was accepting the weight of a man's word, bound in gold, in cattle, in carved wood, in silk. In the end, the question was always the same. Was he willing to give? And in that giving, was he willing to prove his heart? Trials of faith and spirituality. In the ancient world, faith was more than belief. It was survival, law, and destiny. A man without faith was seen as adrift, dangerous, and unfit to lead a household. Women across cultures looked not only for strength or wealth, but for signs of devotion to the gods, the ancestors, or the divine order. His piety could mean blessings upon their children, protection in hard times, and acceptance within the wider community. Without faith, no matter his power, a man could be judged incomplete. In Greece, women looked for men who honored the Olympian gods, who did not neglect rituals or insult sacred spaces. A careless word spoken against Apollo or a missed sacrifice to Athena could mark a man as reckless, cursed, or arrogant. For Greek women, the gods were ever watchful, and the man who lacked reverence risked inviting divine wrath into his future household. Piety was not measured only in offerings, but in daily life, in how he honored guests, respected the dead, or gave thanks after victories. A bride would ask herself, does this man stand humbly before the gods, or does he tempt them with pride? In Rome, faith was tied to the fabric of the state. Women looked at whether a man attended rites, honored Vesta's flame, or took part in festivals that kept the empire in balance. Religion was duty, not choice, and the failure of one man's devotion could bring shame upon an entire family. A Roman woman knew that a husband's impiety might lead to whispers among neighbors, lost opportunities in politics, or worse, the anger of the gods who favored Rome. To marry a man who scoffed at the sacred was to marry misfortune. In the kingdoms of Egypt, faith carried eternal weight. A man was judged not only by the living, but by the gods of the underworld. Women watched for how he spoke of Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth and justice? Did he honor the Nile's cycles? Did he respect the temples, the priests, and the rituals that bound life to eternity? A man who ignored these duties risked his soul's destruction, and with it, the future of his household. Egyptian women often prayed for husbands who lived in harmony with the sacred order, believing that their children's afterlife too depended on his faith. In Christian Europe, piety became even more personal. A man's ability to pray, confess, and live according to the teachings of the Church became a test of character. Women watched how often he crossed himself, whether he kept holy days, and whether his tongue spoke blessings or curses. In an age where sin was believed to stain not only the soul but the family line, a man's faith determined whether he would be a protector or a curse bringer. For women, marriage to a man who mocked the church or ignored confession was unthinkable, for his sins would fall upon wife and children alike. In the Islamic world, faith was the core of life and law. Women looked to see if a man prayed 5 times a day, if he gave charity, if he fasted during Ramadan, and if his words reflected the teachings of the Quran. A husband's devotion was not only proof of his obedience to God, but of his trustworthiness as a leader of the household. Without faith, he was seen as unreliable, careless with duty, and blind to the eternal truth. For many women, piety was more valuable than wealth or strength, for it promised a home blessed with divine favor. In India, faith and spirituality shaped every part of marriage. Women examined how men honored gods, gurus, and ancestors. A man who did not respect the rituals of his family or caste could not be trusted to safeguard the sacred duty of marriage. Women listened to his prayers, watched how he moved in temples, and judged whether his actions reflected Dharma, the righteous path. His piety was proof that he carried not just desire, but devotion to something greater than himself. Beyond the great civilizations, tribal and indigenous societies held their own trials of faith. In African villages, a man's closeness to the ancestors determined his place in the community. If he remembered the dead, if he honored the spirits of the land, he was seen as strong, wise, and trustworthy. A man who ignored these sacred duties was feared, for he might bring drought, illness, or discord. Women often sought men who were not only hunters or warriors, but also guardians of ritual and tradition. Even in East Asia, spirituality shaped a man's fate. In China, women looked for husbands who respected Confucian rites, honored their ancestors at shrines, and followed the balance of yin and yang in daily life. In Japan, Shinto practice demanded reverence for kami, the spirits of nature. A man who neglected such duties was thought impure and a poor candidate for marriage. Women saw his faith as the foundation for harmony in the household, a sign that he could keep the balance between heaven, earth, and family. Across the world, women tested men not by force alone, but by faith. A man who could bend his pride before gods, who could kneel in prayer or bow in respect, showed that he understood humility, loyalty, and duty. His devotion promised not only spiritual safety, but a stable home, blessed children, and honor in the eyes of his people. But faith was not always simple, nor pure. Sometimes men feigned devotion, repeating prayers without heart, or offering gifts to temples while living in sin. Women, wise and watchful, looked for the difference between empty ritual and true piety. They asked not only, does he kneel before the gods, but also, does he live in a way that reflects them? For in this balance, a man revealed his true spirit, and women decided whether his soul was worthy of binding with theirs forever. Thus, trials of faith and spirituality were among the most powerful tests of all. For strength fades, wealth can vanish, and beauty grows old. But a man's devotion to the divine was seen as eternal. In the eyes of women across ages and lands, piety was the invisible thread that held a marriage together, and without it, even the strongest bonds could fall apart. The secret social tests. In every age, in every corner of the world, there existed tests that were never spoken, never declared, yet always present, hidden within the folds of daily life. These were the secret social trials, the quiet judgments that women carried in their hearts when considering the men who wished to stand beside them. A man could offer gold, land, cattle, or even poetry. But beneath those gestures, what truly mattered was who he was when no one was watching. In Rome, at the great banquets where wine flowed endlessly and laughter filled the marble halls, women observed more than they revealed. A man's words to the wealthy carried little meaning, for any fool could flatter a senator or a merchant prince. But the way he addressed a servant pouring his wine, or the manner in which he noticed the trembling hands of a slave carrying food, told a story that wealth could not disguise. Did he sneer? Did he bark? Or did he treat the lowest person in the room as if they too carried dignity? Many a Roman woman weighed her heart on such small scales, deciding not by the grandeur of the feast, but by the humility of the man seated beside her. In the villages of medieval Europe, where feasts were far humbler and held under the flicker of torchlight, the same unspoken rituals unfolded. Women would watch their suitors in the dance halls or at the gatherings after harvest. A man might boast of his strength, raising mugs of ale and shouting over music, but the true test came when a stranger stumbled into the circle, or when a servant girl dropped a tray of bread. Would he mock, or would he bend to help? Would he jeer with his friends, or extend a hand to someone unseen by others? These fleeting moments revealed more than years of practiced words, for in those shadows of life, a man's spirit shone clear. In the bazaars of the Middle East, where spices colored the air and merchants called out beneath the heat of the sun, women too observed in silence. They studied the patience of men bargaining for cloth or grain. Anger, greed, and arrogance were traps into which many fell, but those who showed restraint, kindness, and fairness won more than a good deal. They revealed a steadiness of character, a man who would not crumble when tested by hardship, a man who could be trusted with a household, a family, a life shared. Even in the palaces of Asia, where rituals of honor and formality guided every action, there was space for quiet tests. A woman might not challenge her suitor openly, but her eyes would follow how he bowed to her father, how he spoke to her brothers, how he addressed the lowest servant who carried his sandals. The smallest exchanges, too small for most to notice, were like tiny sparks illuminating the vast unknown. If he failed in those moments, no offering of gold or poetry could redeem him. If he succeeded, his chances soared, for he had shown the truest measure of his spirit. Beyond wealth, beyond power, beyond appearance, it was these invisible examinations that mattered most. The secret social tests were like the fabric beneath fine embroidery. Without them, the surface beauty meant nothing. Women, across cultures and centuries, understood this truth better than men themselves, for men often believed they were being judged only by what they displayed in public, by the strength of their arms, the size of their herds, the thickness of their purses. But women knew better. They looked deeper. They looked into the soul. Sometimes these secret tests were harsh. A man might be provoked, his temper teased, his pride challenged, all so that a woman could see the storm within him. Would he lash out, strike, or crumble? Or would he breathe deep, swallow his fury, and let patience prevail. These trials were not cruel, they were necessary, for they revealed what years of marriage would one day uncover. A husband would face failures, betrayals, and temptations. A wife needed to know how he carried himself when faced with the cracks of life. And so, across centuries, the pattern repeated. From Roman banquets to village dances, from bustling markets to grand courts, women measured men in silence. These were the moments when destinies shifted, when alliances formed or dissolved, when marriages were chosen or denied. Men thought they were the hunters, offering gifts and words to win affection. But in truth, they were the ones being hunted, not by force, but by quiet observation, by eyes that saw what words could never hide. These secret social tests remind us of a truth as old as humanity. Character is never loud, never performed, never rehearsed. It is shown in whispers, in shadows, in the unnoticed acts of daily life. And it was there, in those moments unseen by most, that women discovered who their husbands would truly be. Tests of fertility and health. In the shadows of history, where marriage was never simply a bond of affection, but a critical alliance of survival, the body of a man carried as much weight as his words or wealth. Women and their families, keenly aware of the risks of tying their futures to the wrong partner, devise subtle and sometimes unsettling ways to test fertility and health. For in the ancient world, the strength of a husband was more than a personal trait. It was a promise of continuity, of children to carry the bloodline, and of labor to sustain the household. Without it, an entire lineage could wither. Across cultures, whispers of strange practices followed the marriage process. In some places, men were quietly examined by elders, healers, or even midwives long before wedding vows were spoken. The family of the bride wanted proof, not just of physical endurance, but of vitality, the kind that promised children and secured alliances. A man who was strong in battle but weak in the matters of fertility was seen as incomplete, a risk too great for the future. In Greece, tales survive of women observing potential husbands in the baths, watching for signs of virility and health hidden beneath the cover of casual conversation. A man's physique was more than vanity. It hinted at stamina, resilience, and the invisible balance of humors within the body. Too pale, and he might be thought ill. Too thin, and he might lack the strength to endure labor and war. Too indulgent in food and wine, and he risked impotence, a flaw more damning than poverty. The body was read like a manuscript, every detail holding meaning for those who knew how to look. Among certain tribes and rural communities, fertility tests were whispered of in darker tones. Some say men were given strange brews, concoctions of herbs known for stirring or suppressing desire, and women watched quietly for their responses. Others tell of nights arranged in secrecy, where brides were encouraged to test a suitor before the wedding feast, not for pleasure, but for certainty. These stories drift between rumor and truth, but they reveal a deeper truth of their own, the fear of the barren marriage, a union that promised nothing but silence in the cradle. Religious traditions layered these tests with spiritual weight. In medieval Europe, prayers for fertility were tied to shrines and relics. A man might be watched as he knelt before the Virgin, or touch the bones of a saint, not just to see his devotion, but to measure the sincerity of his pleas for heirs. Women whispered among themselves, if his prayers carried no heat, if his eyes seemed empty as he asked for children, was that not a sign that his soul carried no fire? For in faith as in flesh, women sought signs that their husbands could plant the seeds of a family. In parts of Asia, healers examined men with practiced eyes. The pulse at the wrist, the color of the tongue, the scent of the breath. all could betray hidden weakness. A weak pulse meant poor circulation, and poor circulation hinted at a man who might struggle to father children. A dry tongue suggested imbalance, an excess of heat or cold within, a body unfit to sustain generations. To modern ears, such rituals sound distant, but to those who lived in the uncertainty of ancient life, these were not mysteries. They were safeguards, quiet shields against the sorrow of a childless future. Even more curious were the tests of endurance and labor. Families sometimes required men to prove themselves in fields, lifting heavy loads or working long hours under the sun. This was not merely to test strength, but stamina, the same endurance expected in both bed and field. A man who collapsed under strain was not just weak, he was unworthy. For a household depended not only on affection, but on the endless cycles of planting, harvesting, and sustaining. Fertility of the body was bound to fertility of the land, and both were judged together. There were stories too, darker and more intimate. In whispers carried by folklore, some women were said to secretly observe their husbands on their wedding nights, not with affection, but with calculation. Did he move with strength? Did his breath falter too quickly? Did he sleep too deeply after the act, as though his body had nothing left to give? These were not questions of romance, but of survival. A man's failure in those moments could spell the ruin of generations. In Rome, fertility was tied to omens. Couples visited temples where priests performed rites meant to reveal the future of their union. Some drank mixtures of honey and herbs said to stir desire, and if the man's body responded, it was taken as a sign from the gods. If not, shadows gathered over the marriage before it had begun. Women learned to watch closely, not just for devotion, not just for wealth, but for the one trait that could not be hidden, whether a man could father the children that society demanded. Over time, the test softened, though the expectation never faded. In many cultures, women still observed men quietly, searching for signs of health in the sparkle of the eyes, the steadiness of the voice, the fire of the laugh. Even when no formal rituals remained, the intuition of women lingered. They knew, as their ancestors knew, that the future of a family rested not in gold or reputation, but in the simple truth of a man's strength, stamina, and seed. To speak of such tests today is to look through a mirror clouded by time. Yet the echoes remain. The fear of choosing wrongly, of binding oneself to a partner who cannot give life, is as ancient as love itself. And though modern medicine has replaced herbs and omens, the question still lingers quietly in the hearts of many. Can this union create a future, or will it end in silence? So, in the tapestry of marriage rituals across history, these hidden tests of fertility and health hold their place. They remind us of the quiet, watchful eyes of women, of the whispered fears of families, of the fragile hope for children that shaped so many choices. They are not tales of cruelty, but of caution, born from the deep desire to see life continue against the odds of a harsh world. And now, as we close this journey through the secret trials of men across the ages, from whispers of fidelity to the shadowed tests of fertility, we step back from the ancient firelight. The questions, the fears, the hidden examinations, they have shown us a side of history rarely spoken of. With that, our tale comes to its end. The story is complete, and so too are the echoes of these ancient tests. And that is where we shall leave it. Our journey is done, and the secrets of history return to silence once more. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey. If this story kept you company, eased your mind, or helped you drift into a gentler place, then I'm truly glad you were here. This is what Relic of Stories is all about. bringing the echoes of the past to life in a way that feels safe, calm, and timeless. If you've found comfort here, if these stories help you sleep, inspire your imagination, or simply make the world feel a little softer, I'd love for you to stay a while. You can do that by subscribing so you never miss the next tale we uncover together. Until then, may your dreams be peaceful, your nights be quiet, and your heart be light. Good night, and I'll see you in the next story.